On November 25, 1970, an eccentric Japanese post-war writer entered the headquarters of the Japanese army with his private militia. He kidnapped an army commander and delivered a patriotic speech to the Japanese soldiers. He had a single goal: to restore the power of the emperor. But the army didn't listen to him, and after failing in his attempt, he committed suicide, leaving behind a vast literary work that earned him international acclaim during his lifetime, and even a nomination for the Nobel Prize in Literature. But above any of his writings, his most important work was this final act, a revolt against post-war Japan, which sickened him so much. His name was Yukio Mishima, also known as the last samurai of Japan, and we're going to tell you about his life, which was as interesting as his death. Ronaldo Carrillo here, and this is La Nueva Enciclopedia. Kimitake Hiroka, which was Mishima's real name, was born in Tokyo in 1925. On his father's side, he was actually descended from samurai, since his paternal grandmother belonged to a renowned samurai clan in Japan. She was the one who raised young Mishima with a firm hand until he was 12 years old when his grandmother passed away and Mishima came under his mother's care. Mishima's childhood was quite difficult, since his grandmother exercised strong control over his entire life. Thanks to his noble roots, young Mishima was able to study at the Pierce School, a school attended only by the Japanese aristocracy. Mishima could indeed be a samurai, by education, by blood, and by genetics, and throughout his life he wanted to be faithful to that identity. But it wasn't enough just to have the blood. He had to become the samurai he aspired to be. The greatest goal of his life was precisely to attain all the attributes of a warrior, as he expressed in one of his books. But Mishima was still very far from being a warrior during his youth. As he said in his own words, "I was devoid of flesh, of reality, and of action, and these are things that would come into his life later." For the time being, young Mishima was content to live shut away, reading and writing. In the years of his youth in Japan, those were times of imperial exaltation and Japanese nationalism. In Japanese society, the cult of the hero and the old patriotic deeds prevailed. Literature about the samurai and books written by them were in vogue, and the young Mishima was no exception to this rule. He used to read the Hagakure, an old book that describes the samurai warrior code, and throughout his life he actually considered this book the foundation of everything he wrote. That was the Japan in which Mishima grew up, a nationalist Japan that was very different from the peaceful country it became after its defeat in World War II, a pacifism that he always despised. But we'll talk more about that later. We've already talked about the paternal side, from which Mishima inherited his noble blood, which had a strong influence on him. But the maternal side is also very important, because that's where he inherited his literary talent from. It's thanks to his mother that he gained access to the world of literature. The young Mishima, at just 13 years old, wrote his first short story, and at 16, his first book of stories called A Forest in Bloom, earning the admiration of his classmates and teachers at the School for Nobles. It was truly surprising how a teenager could write so well about topics like beauty and death, in such a profound way that it would have taken any writer years to master. And it was in this first publication that Kimitake Hiroka adopted the pseudonym Yukio Mishima for the first time, thus beginning his successful and prolific career of books and essays throughout his life. But before continuing with his literary career, it is necessary to recount a very important event in his life, World War II. One day, during the war, Mishima received a telegram. It was a draft order for the Japanese army, for the war. Immediately, Mishima went to the barracks with great enthusiasm, but also with the after effects of a cold he had caught at work. When it was time for the medical checkup, Mishima kept sneezing and coughing, and an inexperienced doctor mistakenly diagnosed him with tuberculosis. Instead of arguing, Mishima simply kept quiet about the mistake and was sent back home. Mishima recounts in his own words that, "Once I left the gates of the barracks behind, I started running down the bare and windy slope. My legs carried me quickly towards something that, in any case, was not death. Whatever it was not death. Although from a young age he felt that romantic urge toward a young death, Mishima was certainly not yet a samurai. He lacked what he would later call physical courage. The Mishima who kidnapped the commander of the Japanese army was very different from the young man who simply preferred to read and write in the dimness of night. Far from the sun he would come to love as an adult. He was still the same Mishima who wrote the following poem during the World War II. And the light still pours over men who praise its brightness. I shy away from the sun and cast my soul into the sheltered pit. But as an adult, Mishima comes to understand that for that romantic death, an imposing physique and sculpted muscles were essential, because for him, any confrontation between a weak body and death was inadequate, and at barely 18 years old, he felt unfit for that premature death he longed for. In an interview a few years later, Mishima expressed that during the war, the awareness that death was near was a happier state of mind compared to the present. And even though it may seem strange, I not only remember those thoughts in my memory as something beautiful, but people also become strangely happy in times like those. And it seems beautiful, strangely. And there is another event of special importance in his life also related to the Second World War. And it has to do with the sun and with the building of that sculpted musculature. On August 15, 1945, when Japan lost the war, Mishima was walking under a relentless sun. The war was over, but the midday light shone exactly the same as before. The end of the war was a turning point in his life, and that date left an indelible mark on his memory, because over time, he began to associate that exuberant summer sun of defeat with the widespread destruction of Japan. That sun, which still displeased the young Mishima, was the same one that shone over the wings of military planes, over the forests of bayonets, on the insignias of military caps, and in the blood that the Japanese shed in the war. On this day, Mishima's first unconscious encounter with the sun occurred, a day he would never forget because Japan would never be the same again either. After the end of the war, his hostility toward the sun gradually faded over the years. Little by little, he began to distrust the night that had meant so much to him during the World War II. And finally, in 1952, he reconciled with the sun while traveling abroad for the first time on a ship. From then on, he was unable to separate himself from the sun's rays for the rest of his life. It became associated with his life and his literary career. From the sun's rays, he drew the inspiration to build a powerful physique that would make him an important representative of bodybuilding in Japan. Lifting the heavy steel weights, he realized that strong muscles, a flat stomach, and tough skin matched that fighting spirit he longed for so much. From the cold steel, he gained a new kind of knowledge, the kind of knowledge books cannot teach. And it's very striking to observe that Yukio Mishima was indeed a man of letters, but a very particular one, since it was through training and not through words that he achieved what he sought in his life, to develop the attributes of a warrior. And he reflected that no matter how much the philosopher meditated on the idea of death in the solitude of his room, that philosopher would still be incapable of understanding it as long as he was divorced from physical courage. Because for him, physical courage was the origin of that desire to understand and value death. And that couldn't be achieved by reading and amassing written works. For that reason, we first delve into this side of his life and not into his literary career. Because Mishima wanted to truly be remembered above all else as a man of action and not simply as a writer, like any other. He was a man of letters, yes, but he was one who believed that words are illusions when they are separated from action. And his view on words makes him a special case in modern literature. Despite this, his literary career is more than worthy of mention, because among all his publications there are true gems that are well worth reading. His first novel was published in 1949, and it is Confessions of a Mask. an autobiographical novel published after Japan's defeat in the war, where Mishima confesses his inclination toward homosexuality. A year later, he published Thirst for Love, his second novel, which brought him even more popularity. With this work, during the 1950s, he published Forbidden Colors, Death in Summer, The Sound of Waves, The Seven Bridges. And above all, The Temple of the Golden Pavilion stands out, a novel inspired by a real event, like many of the other novels he wrote. By the 1960s, Mishima had become a truly special figure in his country and also a reference for those young people dissatisfied with the decadence of post-war Japan. During these years, he published The Sailor Who Fell from Grace with the Sea, an important autobiographical essay called Sun and Steel, where Mishima tells his personal story with training. Now, regarding his literary work in this last decade, his final great work stands out, The Sea of Fertility, a tetralogy of books composed of Spring Snow, Runaway Horses, The Temple of Dawn, and The Decay of the Angel, whose last chapter he finished and delivered on the same day he carried out his coup d'etat in the Japanese barracks. The Sea of Fertility is a key and decisive piece in the life and work of Mishima, since the 4 books had a vital meaning for him. We could say that it is his ideological testament, since these books are fundamental to understanding the author's thinking. About this tetralogy, he explained the following in his own words. I divided my life into 4 rivers, the river of books, the river of theater, the river of the body, and the river of action. And those 4 rivers flow into the Sea of Fertility. Anyone who reads the tetralogy will notice how Mishima depicted the decline of Japan in each chapter. The protagonist, the lawyer named Honda, who appears throughout all the books, is the living embodiment of the decadence that Mishima despised. Honda was a man who, in his youth in the early 20th century, devoted himself to reason and studies, and in old age ended up as just another Japanese man of the era, a wealthy, comical man whose great reputation in his career crumbles after being involved in a shameful sexual scandal. Each book in the tetralogy is different from the others, and Mishima uses reincarnation as an important literary device to develop an interesting plot, which begins in the Taisho era from 1912 to 1926 and ends in the liberal Japan of 1975. However, even though reincarnation is fundamental in the tetralogy, Mishima did not believe in it. He did not believe in reincarnation since he thought that his spirit and his body were not interchangeable, and that his spirit would be nothing without his body, and that his body would also be nothing without his spirit. And as a whole, he had to die eternally on November 25, 1970, the day he would finish his last work and commit suicide after failing in his coup d'etat. It should not be overlooked that Mishima was a man who mastered the power of words very well. In fact, in 1968 he was nominated, but unfortunately he was not awarded. And it's possible that his nationalist and traditionalist ideas had something to do with it, even though he was not awarded. Instead, it was his friend Yasunari Kawabata who received it, becoming the first Japanese writer to win a Nobel Prize. But Kawabata even said about Mishima, and I quote, "I don't understand how they gave me the prize when Mishima exists. A literary genius like his is produced by humanity only once every 2 or 3 centuries. He has an almost miraculous gift for words." End quote. In that same year, in 1968, Mishima founded one of his most important projects, what he called the Shield Society, an association of young university students, samurai in the service of the Japanese emperor, whose goal was to rekindle the lost flame of the warrior spirit. The society was allowed to train with the Japan Self-Defense Forces and eventually had about 300 members. However, they never had access to weapons. The members did not receive any payment. They were only provided with a summer and a winter uniform, as well as caps and boots, and the famous combat uniform, which was designed by none other than the only Japanese stylist who had created uniforms for General Charles de Gaulle in France. All the organization's funds came entirely from the income Mishima earned from his literary work. At night he wrote, and during the day he took on the responsibility of commanding his small spiritual army. In a manifesto, Mishima expressed his discontent with post-war Japan because he believed that economic prosperity had turned the Japanese into merchants, and that the spirit of the samurai had been completely extinguished. He also considered the new liberal Japan to be hypocritical, as its constitution, drafted and imposed by the United States, forced the country to renounce the right to war. In that same manifesto, Mishima specified that the Shield Society was an army prepared to intervene at any moment, and the moment arrived. But before narrating this unprecedented event, let's mention a fragment from an interview that Mishima gave 4 years before taking his own life, in which he expressed, "People generally think about an ideal, about a cause, so they soon get tired of simply living for the sake of living. And it's true that when it comes to death, they need a cause. This is what has always been called a noble cause. Dying for a noble cause is the most splendid and heroic way to die. If you don't recognize in your heart the values that transcend you, you'll enter a psychological state where your whole existence has no meaning." On November 25, 1970 hours before committing suicide, Mishima sealed the last work of his tetralogy, The Decay of the Angel, and left a message on his desk that said, "Human life is limited, but I want to live forever." Having completed his most important literary work, he left for the Eastern Command of the Japan Self-Defense Forces, together with 4 members of the Shield Society, using a pretext to visit the commander of the Ichigaya camp, a military base located in the center of Tokyo. When they arrived, the commander noticed that the famous writer was carrying an ancient Japanese sword. Immediately, the commander was tied up, and Mishima, together with the members of his militia, set up a barricade in the office. Then he went to the balcony of the military base to deliver his speech, accompanied by banners. With his words, Mishima denounced the moral misery into which Japan had fallen, and he intended to convince the Japanese army to restore the emperor's power, which had been lost due to the constitution imposed by the United States. "Where is the spirit of the samurai gone?" Mishima exclaimed to the Japanese soldiers, but they only mocked him. Additionally, helicopter noise made it hard for them to hear him. On one of the banners Mishima displayed from the balcony, it read, "The country of our beloved history, of our traditions, Japan. Is there anyone among you willing to die to oppose the Constitution that has torn our homeland apart? If there is, let him stand up and die with us. We have undertaken this action with the burning hope that all of you, who have been granted a pure spirit, can become true men again, true warriors." After finishing his speech, which did not convince the army, Mishima shouted, "Long live the emperor," 3 times and withdrew to the office, apologizing to the commander for the failed action undertaken. Before committing suicide, Mishima composed a death poem, thus following the tradition of the seppuku ritual, also known as harakiri, an ancient Japanese ritual in which warriors voluntarily took their own lives to die honorably. And the last action Mishima performed in life was his painful seppuku. In this way, the most extravagant Japanese writer of the time ended his life at the peak of his imagination and physical condition. And so at the age of 45, he achieved the death he desired, a heroic death, a death he longed for all his life, not without first preparing himself physically for it with great effort. In short, it was a revolt against modern Japan, which made him feel sick, and with his seppuku, he sought to instill in young Japanese people a traditional sense of responsibility. It is very likely that Mishima knew he was going to fail in his attempt to restore the emperor's power, since he was still pessimistic about the situation. But if there's something we can learn from his life and his work, it's that even if disappointment persists, we still have to act, even if it's based on our own pessimism. Because if you try and fail, you can live in peace knowing that you tried. But if you don't do it, it's very hard to forgive yourself for inaction. And in Mishima's case, this resulted in death, which, above all his literary work, was the ultimate expression of his life. Thank you all very much for watching this video. Let me remind you that you can really support us by leaving comments, liking the video, subscribing to the channel, sharing the video with everyone you know, and clicking the bell to turn on notifications. This was Reynaldo Jose Carrillo Vilches speaking to you. This is La Nueva Enciclopedia. As always, we thank you for all your support and many blessings to everyone.